Hey everyone, my name's Steve Robertson. I'm a park ranger here, even though I may not look like it right now. I am a park ranger here at Washington Monument State Park, South Mountain State Battlefield. I'd like to welcome you all out to the park this morning. What we're going to be doing today is demonstrating the loading and firing of a Civil War cannon. And before we fire the cannon, there's a couple of safety things I want to go over. First of all, we on this side are going to be wearing hearing protection, and we're required to do that to save our hearing. The cannon does make a very loud noise when it fires, so we will let you know when we're ready to fire. When we do fire, if you would like to, you might want to cover your ears if you're sensitive to loud noises. Also, we'd ask that during the demonstration, everybody stay at least where these benches are or further back than the benches. Sitting on the benches is okay, but please do not come any further because we need to maintain a safe distance between ourselves and the cannon. So when we fire the cannon, we do, for safety reasons, have a waiting period in between each round that we fire. We are actually going to fire the cannon a total of 4 times today, so you stick around, you're going to get to see the cannon go off 4 times. In between each firing, we're going to talk a little bit about the cannon, the different types of projectiles that the cannon fired, and also talk about the crew and how the cannon is loaded, how it's operated, and what each person does in the process. So with that, we're going to go ahead and we'll fire the first time.
You don't have to cover your ears yet. I'll tell you. I'll tell you. Cover your ears. Heard one of the sounds of the American Civil War. My compatriots and I are members of an organization that does educational programs. We call ourselves the Baltimore Light Artillery. And we're all volunteers, and most of us have been doing this for quite a number of years. So it's my purpose, while we wait out a little bit of time so we can fire again, to describe for you some of the inner workings of the light artillery of the American Civil War. First of all, a little nomenclature. This cannon that you see, this bronze cannon, is called, and it's got a long name, the model 1857 bronze Napoleon 12-pounder light gun howitzer. That's quite a name. It's a design that we stole from the French in the period before the American Civil War. The French were leaders in the 18th and 19th century in terms of technology, military doctrine, policy, uniforms, and equipment, and certainly the United States borrowed a great deal from the French during this period, not the least of which is this cannon. This is the workhorse artillery piece of the American Civil War, because from the standpoint of an overall weapon system, you can accomplish more types of fire missions with this particular type of cannon. In terms of organization, the average infantry company of the American Civil War consisted of roughly 100 men carrying muskets on their shoulders and generally commanded by a captain. That's an awesome responsibility to maneuver that many men around the battlefield. But consider this, in a battery of artillery, north or south, you have roughly 100 men also. But they're kind of split down the middle. Half of those men do what you see these men doing. They're called Cannoneers, and they load and fire the cannon in an effective and safe manner. But the other 50 men, roughly, are called drivers. Their responsibility is strictly to handle the animals, because this cannon typically is pulled by 6 horses during the war, on campaign or in combat. So in addition to all these men, all these animals, you've got typically in a Civil War battery either 4 of these guns or maybe as many as 6, more typically in the Union Army. You've got 2 of these devices per gun. This thing is called a limber. A limber. And you can't see them because we don't have any, but if we did, you'd see 6 horses lined up with their noses facing toward the gun. Inside the chest is where the ammunition is carried. We'll talk about ammunition during our next talk break. In addition to that, you've got supply wagons, you've got an ambulance, you've even got a blacksmith shop on wheels that is all part of this battery. So while an infantry company commander has 100 men, a battery commander, who's also probably a captain, has all these guns, all these men, all these animals, all these vehicles, and he has to manage those on the battlefield and on campaign. It's a pretty awesome responsibility. Now today we're only going to talk about this type of cannon. This is a smooth bore cannon made of bronze. Made of bronze. There were in the American Civil War artillery pieces which were rifled. They were rifled. We don't have one of those out here today. I'm going to talk just briefly about their ammunition for rifled cannon because it's a little different. But primarily what I'm going to talk about is matters related to the 12-pounder Napoleon, which is typically what it was called. That's kind of its nickname. All right, well at this point, we'll have the gunner go ahead and fire another round for you. Commence firing.
Commence firing. Go! Chase, 900 yards.
At a later point, we're going to talk about what each of these men do while serving the peace. But as you can see, it's a choreography. I think of it as kind of almost like a ballet. Notice also, there are very few verbal commands. And the reason for that is on a Civil War battlefield, it is so noisy and there's so much racket that hand signals are typically used by the crew in order to adequately man the piece.
Ready.
Cover your ears.
Go!
So at this point, I want to talk a little bit about the ammunition that Civil War artillery utilizes in combat. And if you want to, I welcome you to come over here. We've got some examples of what that ammunition looks like. If you want to see it a little closer up, that'll probably enable you to better understand how this stuff functions. The first projectile that I'm going to talk about is the most basic artillery projectile. It's called solid shot. That's because this is a solid iron projectile. You'll notice it's round. And it's round because this is a smoothbore cannon. It weighs 12 pounds. And that should give you a hint as to why this is called the 12-pounder Napoleon, because it fires a 12-pound solid shot. This is the longest range artillery projectile of the 4 types of artillery projectiles that this cannon fires, it goes the longest range. Typically we're asked, well, so how far can these shoot? And the standard for measuring effective range in Civil War artillery is how far a solid shot can be fired at 5 degrees elevation on flat ground. And for the Napoleon 12-pounder, that's a little over 1 mile. Now the thing of it is, most Civil War battlefields, you can't see a whole mile. On some of them you can. So for most of the artillery ammunition that's being used, solid shot is used primarily for counter battery fire. When you're trying to disable enemy artillery pieces, you use this. Or when you're trying to batter down perhaps a building at long range that there are sharpshooters in. So it has its application, but it does not explode. All the different types of ammunition are mounted on a wooden block, strapped to a wooden block. This is another solid shot, but you see this wooden block, which is called a sabot or sabot. It's a French term. Back to French design again. All of the ammunition used for the Napoleon has, besides its projectile, and a sabot in the middle, a woolen powder sack that's attached to the back end. This is called fixed ammunition. It's all one piece. So when you see number 1, the Cannoneer with the sponge rammer, we'll talk more about him in a little bit, you see him ram down. He's ramming down something that effectively looks like this, with a powder sack attached. This is an example of shell, which is the second type of ammunition. It looks very much like a solid shot, but it's hollow and it contains a gunpowder charge. It also has a rudimentary time of flight fuse, which can be set for different times of flight downrange. So they were advanced enough that you can plan to cause this shell, which explodes, doesn't just hit the ground like solid shot, but it explodes at some point downrange. You want these exploding projectiles to explode just in front of and over the heads of the enemy target, because it spreads fragments, and those of course are what inflict wounds. There's a variation on this. This is a smaller version for a 6-pounder, but this is called spherical case. It's the same, it's hollow, has gunpowder inside, but it also has round balls, pellets, call them what you will, inside. Now this type of ammunition was very effective on Civil War battlefields. This is not a French invention. This is an English invention, invented by a British Royal Artillery officer whose name was Henry Shrapnel. And this is what's typically used to break up those big, massive infantry charges. Last but not least, and this type of ammunition, the 4th type, is really the most sinister, which rhymes with its name, canister. And it is a tin can full of 28 round iron balls packed in sawdust. This turns this cannon into a giant shotgun. This is what you use against those massed infantry formations at close range, at very close range. Now, there's one Civil War reminiscence that mentions that you could always tell from a distance when an artillery battery switched to canister, because that enemy formation they were shooting at, when they fired canister at them, you'd see a pink haze over their formation. And that's because these things flying through the air dismember, smash, inflict very severe wounds on the personnel that's being attacked. And of course, when and as those tin cans are fired, it doesn't really affect the enemy formation in terms of this being shrapnel, but you can get a sense of what happens to that can when the cannon is fired. So, how do we set this cannon off? And the answer to that is pretty simple. We've got this little device called a friction primer. Now, likely, many of you have seen films. One of my favorites is a Clint Eastwood film that shows Clint Eastwood firing a Civil War era cannon with a cigar. The fact of the matter is, when this cannon fires a service load with a projectile in front of it, that gun can jump back 8 to 12 feet. And if Clint Eastwood was really firing a Civil War cannon, chances are he'd be run over and crushed. But the friction primer, which sets it off, is this little brass tube, and it's more safety. This whole concept of artillery is fraught with safety procedures. This is a little brass tube. Inside of it is a very, very fine gunpowder. At the top of it, there is a twisted wire that goes through the top of the tube. That's called a rubber or rubber wire. It's not made out of rubber, but it rubs a compound at the top of the tube that's very much like what you find on the business end of a kitchen match, a wooden match. You know, you can strike those on all kinds of surfaces. When that rubber wire is pulled through, it causes a spark. That causes the finely granulated powder to blow downward into the breech of the cannon. That's what sets it off most of the time. Now, these are small. They get lost. In one of these crates full of ammunition, you get more friction primers than you get rounds of ammunition. The other thing is, this is a common point of failure when the gun fails to go off or has a misfire. There is a drill for that, and while we don't intend to show you that drill, if we have a misfire, we like to call that a teachable moment. So those are all the different kinds of ammunition and how it's set off. And at this time, if the gunner will kindly commence firing.
Gunner's post. Load. Chase, 800 yards. Ready.
Cover your ears.
Fire.
And these are incremented out in quarter-second increments. And you punch where you want it to go. So you see in our table fire, depending on what type of shot. Yeah. So the only ones we use diffuses on are the spherical case and the shell.
Okay. Wow.
Today we call it the field artillery, but this is a very well organized, drilled choreography that enables these soldiers to effectively fire this cannon quickly and in a safe manner. And in point of fact, every single man that you see in front of you has a job to load and fire that cannon. We're going to start with the corporal, called the gunner. The gunner is the guy who commands this artillery piece. And the tool of his trade is a brass sight called a pendulum hawse. So this is a direct fire weapon system, and it depends upon the gunner being able to see the target so he can estimate the range to it, so he can set off the correct setting on the pendulum hawse, set it on that carriage on the back of the cannon barrel, line it all up, and if he's a pretty good judge of distance, the chances are better this crew's going to hit that target. He's responsible for the management of this group of cannoneers. He's responsible for the safety procedures for this cannoneers, for this detachment, because if your cannoneers are constantly being killed due to accidents, etc., it's hard to recruit new cannoneers. Okay? By the American Civil War, this was the last, the greatest, the final chapter in muzzleloading artillery, and that's a dangerous occupation. All of the other cannoneers all have numbers. I'm going to call their numbers off. They're going to show you the tools of their trade, and I'm going to describe for you what it is that they do. Number one has a thing called a sponge rammer. It's a long pole. On one end, it's wrapped with lamb's wool, and that sponge, as it's known, is kept damp, perpetually damp. And he swabs out the gun, not to clean it, not to cool it. He does that to kill any live embers or sparks that still may be residing inside the barrel. An extremely important safety step. On the other end of the sponge rammer, there's a wooden block, and that's to push this ammunition the entire length of the artillery tube. Now, this is a very physically demanding job. This is a dangerous job. And so number one gets a real workout when he stands at the muzzle of the gun. Number two has this thing that looks like a corkscrew. And its job is to search the piece. That's the terminology from the period. That cloth sack that contains the gunpowder charge, pieces of it, especially the back patch, can end up remaining at the back of the artillery tube. That's a great place for embers and sparks to hide. So he uses that worm to search the piece to snag any of that detritus that's left in the back end of the cannon tube and pull it out so that the next round can be safely loaded. Because if another round were to be loaded and there were an ember in the back, conceivably that artillery piece could go off before its time, and that would be dire for number one. The other thing that number two does, he also is responsible for loading the piece. He receives the ammunition that comes down from the limber chest. He inserts it in the muzzle so that number one can ram it home. And this is the teachable moment part. If we have a misfire, number two has to work his way around the wheel and reprime the piece with a new friction primer from the front. Anybody want to guess why he does it from the front? I told you about Clint Eastwood and what would happen to him if this gun went off. If it went off prematurely, if he came around from the back, he could be run over and crushed. So that's when number two really earns his pay. Number three has on his left thumb a leather sheath. This is called a thumb stall. You probably have guessed already that in the back of this cannon tube, there's a small hole that goes down into the powder chamber. Number three plants his thumb firmly on that hole during the sponging and loading process. That creates an airlock inside the cannon barrel. When number one sponges it out, and especially when he's pulling that wet, damp sponge which fills up the cannon muzzle, you actually create a vacuum. That helps to put out sparks, embers, etc. He has in his other hand a device that looks like kind of like an ice pick called a priming wire. He's responsible for inserting that down the vent in the loading process and punching a hole in that cloth powder sack so that that friction primer, when it goes off, can shoot that flame down into the main. Last but not least, number 3 also assists the gunner at the hand spike at the back of the trail to set off what in the modern artillery they call deflection. You're probably more familiar with the term windage. So he does all of those things. Number 4. Number 4 is the trigger man. And he's got the best job of all. He's the one who pulls the trigger on this artillery piece. Now he has a pouch that carries those friction primers. The other tool he has to have is a lanyard. The lanyard has an iron hook in it. He hooks a little loop on the friction primer. Number 3 helps him set that in the breech. And when he's ready to go, he steps out outside the wheel and prepares to pull that lanyard and set it off. It takes skill to do that because you have to apply a constant straight line vector force to cause that gun to go off. So you'll notice all of these men on the gun are either inside or outside the wheels, and that's prescribed. And again, it's all about safety. Number 5. Number 5 we call the marathon man. He runs the ammunition from the limber chest down to the gun. And from time to time people ask, well, wouldn't it make more sense just to pile the ammunition up by the cannon? Well, so you've got 2, maybe 2.5 pounds of cannon grade powder in each round. You think it's a good idea to have that stuff piled up at the muzzle of the cannon where there's all this flame? Not to mention what's coming at you from the other side. So number 5 carries a round of ammunition at a time in that gunner's haversack, which protects it from flame, and also in the event of rainy weather protects and keeps that powder dry. Now ordinarily the limber chest is a much sought after target by the other side, and it's like, I don't know, doing a hole-in-one in golf. If the other side can strike the enemy's limber chest, because it blows up, and it's like, yay, you know, there's this jubilation. But number 5 helps to prevent that by carrying that ammunition 1 round at a time. At the limber chest, we have number 6 and number 7. These are our mathematical technicians. Some of these artillery projectiles, the shell and the spherical case, have fuses. They have fuses which need to be set. Now these men have tabulated firing data on a chart, so if they don't already have it memorized, they can look up how far 800 yards is in terms of time of flight. And that translates into seconds down to quarters of seconds. They set off that time on the time of flight in order to effectively engage the target. With that, you know how the whole system works, so you can watch this choreography, this ballet, as it takes place and get a better sense of how it all works together. Very few verbal commands, hand signals, etc. Commence firing.
Move.
Better safe than sorry. Cover your ears.
Fire!
So there you have it. A couple commonly asked questions that we frequently get. Often visitors will ask, say, so how quickly can you load and fire this cannon? And the answer is, we can fire it as quickly as multiple times a minute. But, if you do that, it requires you to suspend many of the safety steps that are part of the normal loading process. And that causes the crew to be placed at risk because an accident can happen. So typically, a good prescribed rate of fire is 1 round every 2 minutes. And that enables you to do all the safety steps. But equally important, it enables the gunner and the crew to properly point the piece. Because if you're not hitting anything, what good is it? So it's important for the gunner to be able to properly point the piece to strike the target. And another question sometimes we get is, so where was I going with this? It happens. It happens from time to time. I know. So how many casualties were inflicted by Civil War artillery? We will never know. But there are estimates. And the estimates are, on a Civil War battlefield, depending on the battle, depending on the armaments on both sides, probably field artillery, or light artillery as they called it then, caused perhaps 15% of Civil War casualties. That's not a large number, but I think it's important to note that the greatest value of artillery is as a psychological weapon. The piece has been cleared, and you are fully welcome to come on down and take a closer look. Thanks for your attendance.